Welcome back to Viewer's Choice, Round 3. Thank you all to everyone who voted in the poll, and if you're disappointed that your vote did not come out on top, don't worry, because I will be doing all of the videos that were selected. All of them got more than 10%, so there's clearly a demand for them, and this one was a pretty even race, so all of the videos that were in the poll will be coming out at one point or another. This one came first because, well, it got the top spot. We're looking at the election that ruined everything, and if it never happened by AlternateHistoryHub. This is a hypothetical scenario where if in 1912, Woodrow Wilson did not win the U.S. presidential election. I almost said Prime Minister. U.S. President Woodrow Wilson is becoming a much more controversial figure. Princeton removed his name from their university in 2020, and I think he's being much more scrutinized nowadays than he ever was before. And you can see his rankings, his presidential rankings, being pushed back more as time goes on. So let's take a look at this from Alternate History Hub, the election that ruined everything, and if it never happened. Thank you all very much for your support. Remember to like, comment, subscribe, and without further ado, let's get into it. Oh, and this is a long one too. It's 30 minutes, so yeah, be prepared. And thank you if you sit all the way through.
Woodrow Wilson changed everything. No, wait, don't click off. He really did. We seem to have this idea that the more famous presidents are only so famous because they were the most influential, for good or bad. But there have been a few cases, simply due to the span of time, some presidential legacies sort of just get swept under the rug, forgotten by the public, with most never knowing the good, or as we'll eventually get into, the really, really bad. James K. Polk, as an example, is one of the least thought of presidents, alongside good old John Tyler or Martin Van Buren.
Martin Van Buren, by the way, the only president whose first native language was not English, it was Dutch. Fun little bar trivia fact for you.
But Polk was actually incredibly influential, being the main politician behind annexing Texas, going to war with Mexico, and taking half of its land under manifest destiny. But it was the 1840s, so who cares now? Woodrow Wilson got the same treatment too. To the common public, he's really just remembered for World War I and those 14 points you had to study in high school.
Definitely.
But then, nothing more. In reality, Woodrow Wilson was not just one of the most influential presidents in U.S. history. His policies and strange philosophies defined the 20th century and the international problems we face today. More defining than FDR, Kennedy, or Reagan.
Wow.
Wilson, the soft-spoken Princeton University president who won the election on a fluke, ended up causing every single event after World War I. I think Cypher, the cynical historian, puts it the best.
There is a new party which it is difficult to characterize.
Wilson!
And hope.
Cool. So yeah, I think that that's sort of my general experience too. Obviously, being a Canadian, I didn't learn as much U.S. history in school. I learned mostly Canadian history, and then my own personal interest is more European history and stuff like that. But yeah, Wilson is one that, outside of the past year or so, I think always fell by the wayside. He was definitely just known as World War I guy and maybe the 14 points. And, you know, if you were a little bit more invested, you knew that the opening of Birth of a Nation is the quote from Woodrow Wilson, and it was screened in the White House. But yeah, definitely doesn't go as far as that. And it's a pretty intriguing claim to say that he's more influential than FDR, Reagan, or Kennedy. Oof, quite a claim. Let's keep going.
Only by the end of our time together, you dear viewer have had that same reaction too. I want to imagine an alternate timeline. A thought experiment, if you will. One where Woodrow Wilson never became president of the United States. Never sat in office in one of the most important crossroads in American history. I don't want to talk about literally every single thing Wilson has done right now, but before we learn about his policies, well, let's learn about the man.
Southerner. That I do know now.
I think this guy is the worst president in U.S. history.
Oof.
Seriously. He left the country far worse than he found it, and his pernicious positions and policies perpetually pollute our politics to the present. See what I did there?
Oh boy. Now we've got him started.
Oh, I could go on, but to cut it short, Woodrow Wilson instilled a new form of imperialism called Wilsonian interventionism that the US continues. He segregated the federal government, helped foster the second KKK through his historian credentials, expanded the executive branch's powers to tyrannical proportions, and soured relations with several emerging nations. All in all, someone the world was probably better off without.
That's a good way of putting that.
Sorry.
Woodrow Wilson was defined by his childhood.
Why was that so loud?
His father was a Presbyterian minister who moved to the South in the years leading up to the Civil War. When the war eventually came, young Wilson saw the destruction of the war, saw the South destroyed by its own rebellion, but also the North invading and crushing all resistance. So growing up in the reconstructed South, Wilson had a chip on his shoulder. He wasn't pro-Confederate secession, more like sympathetic to the Southern cause. Young Wilson despised how the Reconstruction was, in his mind, forced upon a war-ravaged South, how black senators were now in office because of Northern policies.
Oh no.
This shaped him into his eventual career as a historian, which, if you want to know more about in detail, Cypher has his writings and papers covered in these videos. The main thing that Wilson subscribed to when looking back on the Civil War was that good old-fashioned lost cause mentality. The idea that secession wasn't over simply slavery, but also over taxes and states' rights. It wasn't just an opinion that the...
And this reminds me a lot of sort of the clean Wehrmacht myth, which I'll still be doing a video on one of these days. That's something I'm much more familiar with than lost cause revisionism. But yeah, it definitely has its parallels of where the loser in the war, in the clean Wehrmacht case, the Germans, right, they sort of try and write history through popular memoirs, through leaders who are also popular, so to say, that really try to push this revisionist history. And I mean, you can still see this in current events today, right? You can see certain countries pushing revisionist history and even even revisionist current events in some sense. So yeah, okay, that's something that I definitely need to look more into is lost cause revisionism, because I'm not as familiar with it. But if it's anything like the clean Wehrmacht myth, then yeah, I can see how this would obviously be a very dangerous ideology.
General public had. It was an actual movement that was influenced by historians with, sympathies. Wilson wasn't just influenced by lost cause revisionism, he was one of the main forces behind it. But even with his experience with the war and Reconstruction, he understood why the South lost, and how secession was the wrong choice. As he matured, his philosophy on the United States began to change. He embraced the idea that the US was the true shining city on a hill, God-ordained nation with the truest civilized creation, democracy. Wilson was a very religious man. This influenced his very philosophy on the world and America's place in it. He had a very my way or highway approach. If you disagreed with his opinions, even if it was, hey, I'm Chinese, I think I know a bit more about what my people want than you, he'd just think, you were wrong, and shut down the conversation. The American ideal was ordained.
So he's like Twitter.
Ordained by God, and anyone else
overall
was just wrong. It didn't help that Wilson really didn't have that good of a grasp on how the world actually worked, which didn't make him the most influential or popular when trying to tell his ideas to a Europe which went through 4 years of war. Finally, now that we got all of that out of the way, let's theorize that possibility. What if Woodrow Wilson is not elected?
So one thing I want to talk about is in the 14 points, right? So the 14 points were basically Wilson's sort of idealistic framework for Europe post-World War I, and a lot of it had to do with peoples really being able to be autonomous in their own country. So for example, in the case of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, this would be Czechs having their own country, Hungarians having their own country, Bulgaria already had its own country, but You see what I mean? And overall, these were basically a failure because one, the U.S. never even joined the League of Nations. It was pushed back by Congress at the time, and while these were ideal sort of, what would you say, ideal, issues to try to live up to, overall, I think they ignored a lot of the reality of what was happening in a lot of these countries at the time, and were ultimately kind of a failure in Europe post World War One.
First, how does this happen? Very easily. Wilson only won the presidency because the election was split 3 ways.
Yep.
Taft for the Republicans on one side, Wilson with the Democrats on another, and Teddy Roosevelt running for the party he created, the Progressive or Bull Moose Party. Roosevelt
Also, there was one other guy running, which was on the socialist ticket. Just one thing to remind you there of.
actually was almost nominated as the Republican candidate, almost dethroning an incumbent president, and if he had stuck the course, he might have actually won the Republican nomination.
Has that ever happened where a president loses in a primary? I can't think of that ever happening, but let me know in the comments. That would be a really interesting case. Huh.
Roosevelt and Taft fought one another and split the Republican vote. And as history has shown time and time again, splitting the vote just leads to, well, the other guy getting it. Wilson got the majority and became president. If Taft simply didn't run for office again, or if Roosevelt and his coalition overthrew him in the 1912 Republican National Convention, Roosevelt would run as the Republican against Wilson. And in a race between Teddy and Wilson, well, we all know who would win. Wilson only got 42% of the popular vote.
Interesting. So, okay, I don't know as much about this because, again, American history is not totally my forte. I do know a bit about it, but not totally. But if Taft was already president, right, and Roosevelt had handpicked Taft to be his successor, right, that I know, which is true. Isn't it sort of Teddy Roosevelt's mistake here to try and run against the current sitting president? I mean, that seems a little, you handpick a successor. I guess he didn't like what he was doing, and so he tried to run against him. But then, I don't know, I wonder if someone that's more informed on this topic could probably let me know. But I wonder if there was just more, maybe some resentment. I don't know. You guys can let me know in the comments.
Alternate 1913. The world is on the cusp of war, and Theodore Roosevelt begins his 3rd term as president. And this would be the term that he knew would define him as a global leader. You see, the election of 1912 was probably the most important election in American history. Wilson and Roosevelt had staunchly opposite opinions on where the US should stand once the Great War began. Wilson wanted absolutely nothing to do with the war, which seems reasonable. It was an opinion shared by most Americans.
Yeah, true,
Why
definitely.
get involved into the most deadly conflict in human history that seemed to be fought between bickering neighbors?
Yep.
But Wilson had his own, Wilson reasons for doing so as well. Remember that shining beacon ideal he had? That America was the start of a new age of civilization? He saw war as the antithesis to this great democracy, against European countries, that was. Wilson was actually pretty lax when it came to the US intervening in Latin America, or nations in his mind
And so would
not
many other
developed
presidents.
enough for democracy. When this war was to be over, he dreamed America would be the mediator between the two sides, and create a middle ground as the moral leader for the West. Picking a side would only ruin such a dream. In fact, even when it came to the final moment in 1917, Germany started back up their unrestricted submarine warfare, sinking neutral ships and offering to Mexico to invade the United States. Wilson still was uneasy, but the tides had changed too far, and he realized America had to get involved. But this time, with a twist on his original idea. America still would retain its moral character while going to war, but only because it wasn't fighting for petty reasons like Britain, France, or Russia, but to make the world safe for democracy. Sound familiar? By the time that 1917 rolled around, Roosevelt had practically ripped out his mustache while demanding for the US to go to war. After the Lusitania was sunk, Roosevelt knew that war was inevitable and wrote furiously that Wilson was a coward for being so indecisive. You see, Roosevelt was a polar opposite opinion. He wanted the US to get into the war to show that it was a real global power. He saw the Great War as an opportunity to finally flex some American muscle and change the globe through force. Now I know that sounds bad for the US to get itself involved purely to show off, but if Roosevelt was actually president and really did get America into the war by 1915, ironically, most of the pains and sufferings of the 20th century as we know them might not have happened. I know, it's weird, but here's the thing about idealism. It's idyllic. Wilson...
Okay, so this might just be my lack of information so far, but so I understand the point here, right? Is that obviously, and I know Wilson is not the greatest president, and he was also a vitriol racist. But one thing that I don't understand here is that trying to bring democracy to especially Europe at this time, right, with its basically authoritarian monarchistic ways, right? You can look at somewhere like, you know, places like the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, even parts of the Balkans, which you know, that again Austro-Hungary controlled, such as Serbia, right? To sort of, you know what I mean? Like, I'm struggling here because I'm doing this like right on the spot live, but that doesn't seem to be the worst ideal. And yes, obviously this can be misinterpreted, like just, you know, the meme of America bringing democracy through weapons, etc. And I understand that, right? I understand that, but I don't know. Especially if he's saying that Teddy Roosevelt was going to get involved in the war anyways. So I don't know. I'm struggling on this one, and maybe with some more time I could think about it and have a better response. But yeah, just on the spot here, I just wanted to put my thoughts forward on this so far.
Wanted a world without war, where America was this bastion of morality, but people don't work like that, and his idealism turned into something far worse than just colonial squabbles. The Lusitania sinks in this alternate 1915. I have no doubt that if Teddy was president, the United States would have mobilized for war within a few months. Now I say mobilized. This was 1915. Even after declaring war, it still took months for troops to be ready, supplies to be organized, and men shipped over the Atlantic.
And that happened in World War II too. I think it took a few months for the Americans to arrive in North Africa. And one of the first battles that America was in North Africa was brutal. It was a complete failure for the Americans, and it did take them a bit of time to sort of get into the game, so to say, to put it very lightly.
In our timeline, even though the US entered the war by 1917, they really didn't flood in until 1918, by the time the war was ending. So the next few months for Roosevelt would be the hardest of his political career. Not only would he need to convince Congress to declare war, but also the American public, who even then were still not interested in sending men to die in a European war. Could he have done this? And that's the problem with hypotheticals. Yeah, it's very plausible he could have, but also there isn't a true way to know. Wilson was actively putting out any fires for war when in office, and it cost him politically. So perhaps the opposite happens with Teddy, who tries to stoke what little flames in America there was for war and revenge. I think he could make a convincing argument for why the US should get involved. Teddy always boasted about America's hardworking nature when faced against an adversary. Because of that sinking, the US began contributing aid to the Allies, so it might not have taken so much to simply go that extra mile.
Yeah, okay, sure. Sure.
Just
All right.
as one would wish to secure their ships from the pesky Krauts, so should...
Use NordVPN if you haven't yet. There you go. Saved you some time. As my internet dies.
Weren't faring to... By 1916, in our timeline, both sides had stalemated. Germany was running out of options as a British blockade slowly strangled its economy and resources. However, France, Britain, and Russia weren't faring too well either. Both sides expected the war to be won by now, but the meta of the time was really imbalanced, favoring defense instead of offense. Railroads and machine guns allowed for trenches to be well defended and impossible to retake since both sides were practically even. On the Western Front, all that really needed to happen was one other nation to get itself in and push the scale in the Allies' favor. Britain, France, and Russia knew that, which is why Wilson's constant "I'm above this" approach really rubbed them the wrong way, especially when it continued as the US was in the war, but we'll get to that later. The Americans didn't...
Yeah, and one thing to note too is that the most famous, the sort of trench warfare and everything that everyone remembers World War I for, a lot of this was on the Western Front, right? The Eastern Front was a completely different story. There was a lot more mobility, and if you look at sort of recreations or in movies and stuff, because obviously the film is quite limited for the First World War, you can see that there was a lot more movement in these. And I know these are representations, they're historical. I get it. Sorry, they're not historical, I get it. But still, you can see the different sort of visualization, and it's an interesting way to sort of look at what was happening on the Eastern Front as opposed to the Western Front, which everyone knows of, trench foot digging in and stuff like that.
Fight as much in World War I in reality, but they were a welcome sign to breathe new life into the Allied effort, just enough to push the Germans, who already won in the East, into mutiny, rebellion, and finally, armistice. Imagine how bad of a sign this would be for the Central Powers, who by 1916 are already fighting a two-front war, and then the Americans show up.
Okay, interesting.
In our timeline, the Germans were able to support their own Western Front by the time the Americans showed up, because Russia was already out of the war by 1918. 500,000 troops to hold back the Allies and France. They don't have this option in an alternate 1916. They simply don't have enough men to hold back both sides. If Germany tried to hold back a break in their Western Front by sending troops from the east to reinforce, this could be the relief that the Russians needed in 1916 to buy themselves some time or even make gains in the war. Speaking of which...
Okay.
The Russians were woefully under-equipped and technologically backwards compared to Europe. So there is no steamroll with mechanized tanks like in World War II. Any gains would be slow, but they would be gains. Germany would fall back mostly because of the pressure from the West. Victories, any at all, I don't think would be enough to help the Tsar keep his position. Even with the US involved, I could see the war going into 1917. A 1917 which created food shortages and a harsh winter for the Russian populace. Something like a February Revolution still might have happened. However, the biggest change, since this is an alternate 1917, is the war ends far sooner.
Yeah.
The provisional government that replaces the Tsar oversees not a war of failure, but thanks to its allies, a war of victory. I think you can see where I'm going with this. The Bolsheviks only gained legitimacy because of the failure of the provisional government. A horrible summer offensive in 1917 only left the government appearing weak and unable to rule. The army had no supplies. They were rebelling and refusing to fight. This fanned the flames for another revolution, and wouldn't you know it, Lenin comes back into Russia, and the Bolsheviks, at the time only an extreme part of the Petrograd Soviet, take over. If Germany's war effort weakened by 1916 as the Americans came in, then such offensives by 1917 might not have been failures, but victories. Or even the war might be over before any such offensive could take place. With the war ending under provisional government rule, this boosts their popularity and secures their position as leaders of a czarless Russia. There is no Brest-Litovsk Treaty which loses Russia its land, and so when that inevitable meeting of the victors occurs, well, Russia, being a part of the victors, doesn't allow any of its land, like Poland, Ukraine, or the Baltic states, to be lost.
Interesting. So, okay, so let's think about this. So, Russia is see, I wonder if, though, because a lot of the unpopularity towards the government was not just because of the war at this time, although this certainly did not help. But I wonder then, so if the Bolsheviks would still be gaining power, but it would be in a political sense. Oh, wow, that's super tough to say. But what an interesting timeline where Ukraine, Poland, the Baltic states, they don't exist. The Russian Civil War, is there still a civil war? Maybe the whites have more power at this time. Really interesting. This is why, like, I don't like doing the what if altist. The what if alternate history stuff in a reaction format, because it's like you got to sit and you got to think about the consequences. And because I'm doing this all live, it's like, man, what would happen? Like, you only get like first impressions, right? So, oh well, let's keep going.
Russia survives the war without
I hope you guys
a
don't
communist
mind.
revolution, which is why when I said Roosevelt wanting to get into the fight sooner, in hindsight, actually would have been the better timeline. And with that, the war probably ends around 1917. The Central Powers simply don't have the manpower or economic might of the Allies, with Britain and the US backing it. That's 2 years of fighting that never happened. Sure, millions by now have already died for a pointless war between 1914 to 1916 or 17. However, the war wouldn't be seen in the general mindset as such a tragedy, just an awfully brutal one, a taste of why modern wars shouldn't be fought in Europe. Speaking of legacy of this war, if Germany was defeated easily militarily and they didn't have to face revolutions or the lack of supplies, there still isn't a way to predict how they would end up. The fate of their future is entirely in the treaty and how they would lose the war, which I can't predict for certain, but there are a few possibilities for how it turns out. So we'll just rush through this. Germany is defeated so badly, they end up losing land and become far smaller than even their post-war borders. The Kaiser resigns and Germany becomes a democratic nation.
Okay. Sure.
Germany is defeated just as badly as the first option, but the Kaiser remains in power with his influence greatly diminished, becoming something of a parliamentary monarchy like Britain.
See, what's interesting though is that at this point, really the Kaiser was still a figurehead anyways, right? So around, 1918 in our timeline, even by 1917, 16 or so, the actual affairs of the government and the military, most essentially the military, and to this point extending into the government, was handled by people like Ludendorff and Hindenburg, right? So I kind of wonder though, like, if the Kaiser stays on, he's still more as a figurehead. He doesn't have as much power, but then what do people like Hindenburg and Ludendorff do? That's kind of an interesting question. That's really tough to say off the top of my head. Maybe then in this situation, Germany would go more towards authoritarian state with a shamble of democracy, sort of how Romania looked in our timeline post World War One, maybe even Yugoslavia to an extent. Again, tough to think of this like right on the spot, but cool, interesting scenario.
Germany loses the borders that it did in our timeline. However, the treaty is not as severe.
Yeah, wouldn't have happened probably because of the French, but hey, whatever.
The most extreme option, Germany is completely militarily defeated. The Allies push in and occupy the country just like in World War II. Basically, Germany as a nation doesn't exist for at least a few decades, or until they decide it can be on its own again. This would lead to a lot of colorful debate on which power controls what. Really, there are so many options I could go on. This is what I could predict though, and it all centers around Wilson and Russia. Roosevelt was against Wilson going to the treaty conference in Paris because he believed that Britain, who fought more, should have had more of a say. That opinion easily could have changed if the US fought only 1 year less than Britain, so perhaps he still goes, or at least as a diplomat with his ideals in place. The main thing that changes in this timeline isn't the inclusion of Roosevelt, but the absence of Wilson. Wilson pretty much used the treaty conference as a way to promote his own worldview, the most infamous of which was, well, the League of Nations. Austria-Hungary still would collapse, and new nation-states take its place just like in our timeline. But for the victors, they would...
I'm glad he said that too, because the writing was definitely on the wall at this point for Austria-Hungary. There was no way that the empire was going to survive in any state or form that it was in, no matter the timeline. Even if the war had only gone on for 1 year, there was no way the monarchy would have survived it. wouldn't have happened.
Not lose their territory. Russia going forward still remains relatively backwards compared to the West, but it would never see the mass collectivization and famine like under Lenin and Stalin.
Good point.
Which brings me to the collapse of the Tsar and the failure of the war was the perfect storm to allow such an extremist and violent section of Marxism to take over. The Bolsheviks were the farthest of extremists. They didn't just go after the former autocrats of Russia, but the Mensheviks, less extreme communists, and socialists as well. That iconoclastic, autocratic, and brutal zeal that became the defining mark of communism was birthed from Lenin and his war against anyone he perceived as an enemy of the revolution. Without Lenin, the entire fate of socialism in the West entirely changes, along with the enemy that basically fueled Wilsonianism into the modern day.
Okay.
Without the Bolsheviks, there is no great enemy. The rise of communism was such a series of specific steps, I doubt it would be replicated into the 20th century without Russia. It really was only because of the desperately poor environment in that country that led it to be. That brand of communism simply doesn't arise.
So I wonder though, because there was a lot of fears too in our timeline of post-World War I communism within Germany, right? And a lot of this was blown out of proportion, but I wonder if without the Russian model, as it's called, as was pushed in a lot of the European states post-World War I wonder if Marxism of the form that it took would still be possible in somewhere like Germany, being a major power as well, of pushing it more towards extreme socialist ideology or whatever you want to call it. Though he does make a good point in saying that yes, the rise of the Bolsheviks was a perfect time, perfect place type situation. I'm not saying, come on, don't stop typing the comments saying you're saying Bolshevism is perfect. I'm not, but I'm saying it was in that perfect time, perfect place situation. So I wonder though, could it have taken shape in the same form? Probably not, but would we have seen something different? That's sort of the interesting question of what ideologies and influences of different ideologies would have arisen in a post-war, and especially with a ruined economy for a lot of the major nations, right? Think about actually France too, right? There was a lot of opponents of the Third Republic leading up to the Second World War. Just so many possibilities. It's so hard to think out on the spot, but yeah. Let me know what you guys think in the comments.
Left to the history books, like anarchism.
Oh, snap.
It's almost the Avengers logo.
So both sides, capitalistic and socialist, are less extreme in this alternate 20th century.
Maybe.
There is no great war between ideologies, which is what Lenin and Wilson ended up perpetuating in their states. Which is where things actually start getting weird. Because a lot of policies were shot down in the West once communism rose, because people rightfully feared it'd lead to a Lenin rising in their country. Which is where I'm going to take a detour.
Rightfully? Okay.
As with anything hypothetical, predictions aren't 100%. Just possibilities and an alternate path. And in politics, just because a party or politician wishes to do something doesn't mean they could always do it. Opposition always exists, and those outcomes can't simply be predicted. However, if Teddy stayed in office to see the US win the war, this would have been a massive win for the Republicans. They'd have political clout, and potentially could have enacted some new legislation. Teddy, in his first 2 terms, had busted monopolies and created national parks. But he wasn't just satisfied with that. And in the 1912 election, he laid out his goals. A complete overhaul of lobbying in Washington, a registration for lobbyists, and limits on campaign contributions, social insurance for the elderly, a nationalized health service, federal income tax, and an 8-hour workday. The most interesting idea for me is recall elections for those in office and judicial. Say the court makes a decision that...
So interesting how a lot of those policies are still policies that are being talked about today. I mean, especially in the US, right? In terms of healthcare. Healthcare, I could be sitting here for the next 12 hours, still not cover 10% of it and be wrong half the time, But obviously being a complex subject. But yeah, I mean, I remember that Social Security, which was proposed by Johnson, correct me if I'm wrong here, just saying, don't take my word for it, was supposed to be pushed on to different ages as well, because right now Social Security only kicks in when you're 65, I want to say. Sorry, Canadian here, apologies. But yeah, so this was supposed to be going down lower, and so you would have sort of different welfare state policies. So imagine if the United States pushed more of these welfare state policies. Wow, what would be the big differences? God, again, another sit here for 10 hours. Interesting.
The citizens disagree with. It can be overridden by popular vote. If Teddy was in office, it's likely the war would have taken up a majority of his third term. But considering how hands-offish he wanted to be in the peace conference, unlike Wilson, I think he, or at least some in Congress, could have gotten a few of these concepts into legislation 100 years ago. In the words of Emperor Tiger Star,
He did it with sanitation, he can do it again.
so since we got that out of the way, I decided this last
No
part
idea
would
what that
be...
means. So one thing I wonder that, okay, so I'm just not as like familiar with the hard details of the post World War I conferences. So let's talk about the Treaty of Versailles. A lot of the punitive measures were being pushed by the French, particularly, and the British as well, though a lot of the more punitive things were being pushed by the French. So if Roosevelt was more hands-off, I wonder if it would actually be even harsher measures that were pushed on to the Germans by the victorious Allies at this point. That's the thing. I just wish I had read more. I didn't know that this would go as much into World War I as before. But God, I really wonder that if he was more hands off, would the Treaty of Versailles have been better or worse? That's the difficult question, and it's really tough to say. Let's keep going because this is gonna. I want to hit this goal. I want to hit this video to be 45 minutes. So I'm almost there. I've got 6 minutes to go. So let's keep going. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. Be happy to have a discussion on this one. I really want to.
The fate of Germany in a quicker war is entirely up in the air. However, I think there's one pretty simple answer. Hitler doesn't rise. Now, why do I say that?
Maybe.
Hitler's rise to power was not simply him walking into a defeated Germany and saying he is Führer now.
Yes.
It was just like World War I or Wilson's election, only the result of a string of unique and bad occurrences.
Yep,
The
another
fear of the
perfect
Bolsheviks
time,
was
perfect
a
place.
very real reality for post-war Germany in the 20s and 30s. The Soviets were neighbors to Europe. There had been brief yet failed communist revolutions in 1919 in Berlin and Munich, and just like
As well as one in Hungary too. The Hungarian Soviet Republic, which lasted like 2 months, I think. There was and look at that! I pulled my headphone cord out. How professional! There was also one that happened in, I want to say, I think it was Czechoslovakia as well. There was a lot of pushback from communists and socialists against the sort of democratic state too.
during the Cold War, and fear of the Reds destroying everything was something in the public conscience. Maybe because that's what the Soviets kept saying they were going to do. While Hitler, yes, rode in on the public's fear of the Jews, this also was hand in hand with the fear of the Bolsheviks. But if the war ended
definitely.
in a
That's one
crushing
of his
German defeat,
guiding
and before
ideologies.
the Bolsheviks ever could take control of Russia, those steps that allowed the Nazis to come in power in 1933 become an impossible uphill slope. There simply is no great enemy to fear, and I doubt such a thing as the Reichstag fire would ever have occurred.
Yep.
I really doubt
Totally agree
World
with
War
him.
II, at
Totally
least
agree.
the European war we all know, would have ever occurred. Many wars probably still might happen. Italy,
Definitely.
the Balkans are still a thing, but I doubt the Nazis ever rise to power.
Yep.
What else that wasn't Germany? Oh yeah, the federal government would have remained desegregated. Wilson did that. In fact, the history of civil rights in America might have also went down a different path.
Yeah, probably the biggest failure of Woodrow Wilson too, and one of the most ashamed things of Woodrow Wilson is how far he pushed back the rights of black employees to be able to work for the federal government, which is a large employer, I mean, of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Americans to this day, right? And really is able to push certain people into positions of authority to which they can make impact for their communities. So really, really is a shame that that segregation was entrenched and made worse under Wilson than before.
Wilson is a complex figure in history. He was a man of startling contradictions. Wilson envisioned liberty as only spreading from a strong central government, or at least a strong central leader himself. Only him, an intellect and orator, could champion democracy through U.S. foreign policy. But in reality, it was just advancing U.S. interests under another name. Wilson either purposely or unintentionally misunderstood the world he wanted to change, and create a mindset which didn't reflect that world, or at worst, didn't care to. Even outside...
So this is one thing that I want to have like a greater discussion on, which again, I'd like to think more and read more about this, but the intent is obviously important when you judge someone based on their actions. And the intent of bringing democracy, which I hope no one would argue, but is arguably the best system for people to live under, is trying to bring democracy. Is that inherently a bad thing? I mean, again, this is way more complicated than I can just sit here and say, right? And within a minute or two. So let's keep going though.
Europe. Wilson
maybe I'll do a video on this.
Used his ideology to send the US into Latin America to protect their interests. And it was really because of this that set a precedent in an age where such practices were becoming less acceptable to an isolationist public. The Wilsonian ideal is the one that still dominates the United States. Fighting for democracy in actual true circumstances is a noble one. But ever since its inception, we have to understand it's also been a double-edged sword. One that can be corrupted into serving ulterior motives under the costume of liberty. It's a reason U.S. foreign policy post-World War II has seemed so contradictory. It ended up overthrowing governments in Latin America and the Middle East. Teddy's old speak softly and carry a big stick style of imperialism was unique. It wasn't colonialism. The US was sick of that after the Philippines. It was more of,
and what about Hawaii?
Get in, get out. Wilsonianism was about transforming the country that the US invaded. Wilsonianism did replace this old imperialism, but also modified it enough for imperialism to evolve and survive in the next stage of global empire, the battle over ideologies, the Cold War, or now, the battle between West and East. You know how they say the road to hell is paved with good intentions? Well, our road to hell was paved by mixed intentions. Wilson transformed foreign policy into a holier-than-thou, protector of civilization approach, even when, it wasn't. But guess which one stuck around the longest? Now you may say, Cody, this was 100 years ago. Surely you can't put the blame on the rise of communism, Nazism, foreign endless wars, and the Cold War all on one man's presidency, can you? Yes.
Nice. I like that anticlimactic yes. Yeah, so this is definitely a topic that I think I need to read more about this, because this is, it's a very, very bold claim, and like any new piece of information that you hear, you should be always initially skeptical of it. But yeah, overall, that was a great video. Hope you guys liked it. Made it to under 45 minutes, so hey, mission accomplished. Thank you all very much for watching. I need to go read more. I would love to have a super lively discussion here in the comments. Even if it gets political, hey, what do you think? Wilsonianism, America bringing democracy around the world. Let's go on that topic. Thank you all very much for watching, and I will see you guys in the next video. Take care.